introduction. Knock on my door. You can also send an email ahead of time, and it increases the chances I'll be in the office. So, I know very few of you, Maggie and Sarah and Heidi and Melinda. You know a little bit. So I certainly haven't been overtaxed thus far as an adjunct professor. So do feel free to, if there's anything that I say here that sort of rings bells, feel free to let me know. And despite the nice things that I was just described as, I do know something about decision-making processes, normative and prescriptive ways of making decisions. I'm not an expert in energy systems. I defer you to people like Hadi back here, who I think is one of North America's energy system experts. But as Melinda says, I didn't know anything about nanotechnologies either, and that went okay. So it's knowing something about decision-making is actually sometimes useful. Okay, so 10 things not to like about how BC and Canada make energy development decisions. I started to do a talk about things I like, but that would have been a very short talk. So I thought it was better to say things that I don't like. So I'm focusing on large energy projects. I'm involved in various capacities in several of the larger energy initiatives now underway in Canada and the US. So how are these decisions made now? How could better decisions be made? And why should we care? So I'm focusing on large energy projects, the consultation and decision-making side. I'm not talking about energy strategies, which is, I think, a really interesting topic. It's separate, but would be quite different. And to talk about energy strategies, need to talk about big, small projects, sequencing, public-private, personal initiatives, all kinds of things. So I'm really focusing on how can BC and Canada make better decisions about large energy projects. My perspective, just a little bit on background, I'm a decision analyst, basically study decision-making processes of individuals and groups. And I've been able somehow for the last 40 years to sort of cobble together a living doing a fair amount of applied work, but also a fair amount of research work. And that combination really, really interests me a lot. So a lot of work descriptively, sort of what is being done, but also prescriptively, my more decision analysis side, how to improve current processes. And in my case, experience drawn from economics. My master's degree is from UBC, sort of doing benefit cost analyses. Applied ecology, psychology, and how to structure decision making, particularly the deliberative or consultative side. So I'm not an engineer. And I'm not a politician or lawyer, which I think is a good thing because, well, I can't count. These three groups are really greatly overrepresented, I think, in Canada's decision-making processes. Very few people who know much about decision-making who are part of Canada's important decision-making processes. So I should mention also, if there are quick comments anywhere along, quick questions or something, I'm happy to entertain things anywhere, and I'll certainly stop by something like 10 after, so there's a little time for questions. No longer than that. So I'm always interested in principles. This slide got kind of funky, but what principles should guide decisions about consideration of large energy projects? The first thing that should hit you about this slide is there's a lot of stuff up here. I think large energy decisions are among the more interesting and complex decisions that we need to make as a society. So I'll sort of work through some parts of this list. I think solutions should be long-term, sustainable, should be fair, equitable across different segments of the population. Clearly, let's try to protect the environment while providing profit for some of the lead players. We want to provide jobs to citizens. We want to be efficient, avoid delays in the process. At least delays that don't really yield any information or knowledge. If we have consultations, let's make them meaningful rather than sham consultations. Let's encourage learning. Switching up to the top, something, I don't know what happened to the formatting here, but they should be cognitively tractable, fancy word just for saying people should be able to understand what's going on. If you're wanting people to make decisions over something, let's make sure everyone understands that set of things over which decisions are made. And just another note there, I'm often involved in processes where experts have held some information to themselves, information dealing with uncertainty or model results, etc. Because in sort of caricature of their words, the public wouldn't understand. And I have yet to be in any process over 35 years where clearly articulated, clearly explained, whether it's math or modeling, cannot be understood by the legitimately involved people in the public. So I don't think that, I think if it's our duty as analysts, as academics, as people involved in this process to make things cognitively tractable. We need to be sensitive to vulnerable populations, follow legal mandates, be flexible as information changes. That sort of fits with being adaptable. Let's be complete. Let's get all the values and interests on the table. We can worry later about how we're going to deal with values that seem incommensurable. Let's get them all on the table. The hard values, the soft values, the tangible values, the intangible values. And on that area, I've done quite a bit of work over the last 25 years with Terry Satterfield. It's an area where we have slightly different perspectives, but I think a lot of fruitful collaborations. It's actually on Terry's graduate committee, PhD committee way back when. We need to be accurate in terms of the facts. We need to be complete in terms of the values. And I think that facts-values distinction is one that I probably will keep coming back to. This last part, which got kind of messed up, I think we should be appropriately informative. So many large energy projects pride themselves on producing literally warehouses full of information. That's not being appropriately informative, that's being overload. So let's think about what information is actually needed for decision making. We should, I'd like to have projects that enhance BC's or Canada's reputation. We haven't done too well on that for the last 10 years. And I'd like to encourage stability. In other words, it would be nice if the decisions that we make have a broad enough base of support so things actually can go forward. A little bit less court time, a little bit more actual implementation. So, and there are others. So that long list, whatever's there, maybe 20 things. I'll talk a little bit later about some of the psychology involved behind this, but something I'm really interested in are choices that are made. Herb Simon won a Nobel Prize for his work on lexicographic choices, where if you make choices too complex, people end up choosing just one thing that's most important to them. They order it, and they go for the one or two things most important. Prominence effect in psychology, Paul Slovic and others, Amos Tversky have looked at prominence effect for 30 years. Same kind of thing. We tend to really focus on dimensions that are most prominent. I think that's scary with large energy decisions, and I'll come back to that later on, because I think all these things need to be on the table. So if we go for one dimension or two dimensions, it makes me really scary. So anytime anyone from the BC government stands up and says, I love LNG because of jobs, what goes on in my mind is, well, what about the 19 or other things that you need also to think about? So I think it's very dangerous if we make these into one-dimensional decisions. They're not. These are all principles that I think should be on the table. So we've got as many as a dozen now large Alberta-based pipeline projects involving different things, bitumen, refined crude, LNG. They're kind of going every which way. Enbridge Northern Gateway is coming out west from Alberta. Keystone, TransCanada, Trans Mountain. We've heard a lot about this lately. Burnaby Mountain, Kinder Morgan. Spectrum Energy heading east, Ontario, Illinois. There's Enbridge is talking about something north, TransCanada going to the Gulf Coast, and others. So if you look at a map of Alberta and where these various pipelines may go, kind of heading out every which way. A lot of activity, though, and a lot of push to try to do something with the oil sands capability. Current situation for exports, just real briefly, U.S., which is Canada's most important market. U.S. imports are down, partly because of the extensive reliance now on fracking and other reasons. Over the past 10 years, Canada's role in the U.S. energy picture has actually become more important. Imports have gone up. So Canada's share of U.S. imports has gone up quite dramatically, so doubled roughly from 1/6 to 1/3. Bottom line, despite the sort of sad stories that we hear, actually BC, Alberta, Canada are all doing quite well in terms of making some money off of energy exports. So you might think that we have a good national energy strategy in place, but we don't. So what I'm not talking about today, but I think is a very interesting topic, and I'm sure others in the room would have good thoughts about this, including Hadi. Canada has no national energy strategy. We really don't. We don't know what we're doing in terms of generating, importing, and exporting energy, despite the fact that this is so central to Canada. The U.S. has sort of a skeleton, but those parts have not been passed by Congress, and there's some real inconsistencies between, say, Department of Energy's interpretation, EPA's interpretation, et cetera. But they are working on it. And there is a skeleton, and there's more of there is a reasoned dialogue going on in the U.S. We can talk more about that. And the UK is working really hard, and I think in a much, much more sensible way to come up with a national energy strategy. So Canada doesn't, BC doesn't. We could look to the U.S., because what they're trying to do, I think, makes some sense. We could look to the UK, where they're having some measure of success. I don't get a feeling for much of that going on. The bottom line for me is if there were a national energy strategy in place, provincial energy strategy, it would help kind of set the context, set the framework for these large energy projects. Because that doesn't exist, each large energy project, each Northern Gateway pipeline, each Kinder Morgan, basically has to reinvent that wheel with some help from the National Energy Board and the SEA regulations, et cetera. But there is not that sort of guiding strategy in place. So it creates a lot of problems. They're troubling problems. I think they're very costly problems in many ways. And that's what led to these 10 things that I think need to be changed, just to start bringing up our large energy project decision-making process sort of in line with what I would call minimum standards. This is not really doing anything hugely innovative, but it's just looking around what's other things going on in the world, other things going on in Canada and BC and in other areas, and saying, what is it that we might do? And you'll note my somewhat catty asterisk, making up stories about LNG futures. I think there's a lot of that going on in BC right now, is not the same as having an energy strategy. It's basically reflects what most professionals in these different areas might regard as standard practices. So it's sort of, you know, if you were a surgeon and you went into a hospital and whatever, they didn't put blood for operations in refrigerators. You'd look at that and say, something's wrong. You know, you can't really store the blood unless you put it in a refrigerator. Or if doctors didn't wash their hands before operations, you'd say, hey, that's kind of standard practice. And I think we're at that level in Canada. I mean, those are strong metaphors, but I think even at that very basic level, things like washing your hands before an operation, we aren't doing many of those things in BC or Canada, which is troubling. Is that? Can we save that? A 5-second answer, but it doesn't really do worthy to your question, is I think an implicit strategy is not a strategy. That's what I would, that's maybe a crappy answer, but let's come back to that. So, my 10 criticisms, and I'll sort of work through each of these, and obviously any one of these could open up into discussion. So 10 things that I think are really causing harm. One is that our process is basically adversarial by design. It's set up as an adversarial process, which means you have a lot of competing analyses. I've been part of several of the panel hearings, which I'll sort of get to more explicitly, and a fair amount of contact with folks at National Energy Board and elsewhere. And essentially, each party has their own perspective. Each party hires their own consultants, either from the private sector or academics. There isn't really a forum for working those out. One person speaks, another person speaks, another person speaks, and a small group of people is supposed to somehow work through all this and make sense of it. So we're lacking the dialogue that could lead to some sort of consensus in terms of the analyses. Each party hires their consultants, and depending on how deep your pockets are, that can also change your ability to conduct analyses. A recent court hearing I was in Alberta, the side I was on, which was the side of an Aboriginal group, we had 4 people in the room. The opposing side, which was funded by an oil company, had probably 30 people in the room. So that's not an unusual situation. Because it's adversarial by design, you get disagreements among experts. And I have that in quotes. And there's not a forum, really, for structured dialogue or actual consultation. Consultation requires a back and forth, requires an interactive part. Again, we typically don't have that. And the criteria for being an expert is I think, very shady. Mark Bergman, conservation biologist from Australia, editor of Conservation Biology, has written some really good stuff about expertise. But I think our standards, I mean, even just that, even having decent standards for expertise would really help. You probably have seen the same headlines I have in the Vancouver Sun that says, scientist, quote, scientist says, da-da-da-da. It's a very loose label to apply in terms of being criteria for expertise. So competing analysis, disagreements among experts, I think we end up with an erosion of public trust, which I find very sad. I would really like to live in a society where levels of trust in the government are higher than they are and where the government has more credibility. I would like that. A lot of duplication of effort, which somebody pays for, and I can assure you that in general it's you and me. We're the ones ultimately paying for this duplication of effort. And this last line ends up a lot of stuff going to court, so there's a lot of money spent on litigation. Second, sort of fitting with this, is that a lot of the major decisions are being made in Canada by quasi-judicial panels, typically 3-person panels. 3-person panel for Northern Gateway, Kinder Morgan, a lot of Alberta oil and gas compensation under the Métis Act of 1990, which sounds great but is hard to implement. Typically you have 3-person panels, often appointed by the National Energy Board. Most, in fact, all the cases I'm aware of, appointed by the National Energy Board. So you end up with 3 people, intelligent, caring, trained people who are asked to basically rule on these very, very tough questions. What do I not like about this? Basically, as noted earlier, a lot of these decisions are quantity-based. Each of, for example, in Northern Gateway, there are over 2,500 speakers, and each one had 10 minutes to speak. Some First Nations had a little bit more time. But I think that's crazy. If you get somebody in who actually has something to say, who's thought about the topic, you give them 10 minutes, then sit down, then get the next person up. And again, if we have that much information coming in, how can anybody, how can even these 3 people and their staff make any sense of that flooding of information? Of course, everything's in transcripts, everything's videoed, everything. So the panels end up with warehouses full of potential information and quotes. But unless you have objectives, standards, there's really no way to review, grade, or organize it. You could even go back to that second slide of mine, which had those 20 criteria. Even if you use those, actually, starting today, when you sat, I think it's a recycling thing going on at UBC, sort it out. That would be great. I'd love to hold that up in front of these panels and say, sort it out. I mean, even if we could sort out the information into bins, covered, so that we knew what fit here and what fit there. I don't think we even do that level. So there's no clear way to review, grade, or organize. Panels end up with a mix of values and facts. I don't know how many of you have read Dan Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Great book, bestseller. Actually, let me ask, how many people know that book? Well, okay, 10 hands or so. So he talks a lot about system 1 way of judgment decision making, which is kind of automatic, intuitive. System 2, more deliberative, cognitive. And the panel ends up with a lot of both. Now, we don't know, and they don't know, I would claim, how that plays out. To what extent are they being rational, cognitive, et cetera, and to what extent are their heartstrings getting tugged at and they're really deciding things on emotion, intuition, et cetera, which I think in some cases is very appropriate and helpful. In this case, in large energy projects, I would say not. So, how does that mix work? And I think the panelists have, is there a way to raise this up? Anybody know? so I get the back, the bottom part? I did it on my computer. It's on a stick on this computer. Oh, okay. Got it. Got it. Well, we'll live with this, I think. Yeah. My apologies. I could have come earlier probably and fixed that. But so panelists have some content knowledge, but they don't really have much expertise. And the key thing here is reaching the public interest. And you'll note that any of these decisions, Northern Gateway is the one that's already, a recommendation already has been made. And the decision was made to go ahead to give a green light to the project in the public interest. So public interest means this balancing across all these different concerns and objectives. So looking at all those different trade-offs. Again, if that's not explicit, if it's implicit rather than explicit, then I don't think it's a job done well. So third, moving along, no real standards for consultation. You often have conflicting goals. Are people stating their positions, or are they engaging in dialogue? Essentially, the system we have now, state your positions, shut up, sit down. Rather than what I think would be much more helpful, smaller number of participants and more dialogue. So that sort of leads to conflicts. Do we want depth or breadth? Are we really trying to get all these thousands of people involved, or might it be better to work with smaller groups and a more focused, more in-depth discussion? I would prefer that. We don't really deal well with conflicting knowledge systems. Sort of this broad-based science basis. But what about resource users? And what about traditional local? Not just Aboriginal, but also people who've lived in areas and hunters, gatherers, et cetera. I don't think we do a good job of integrating information from these different groups. We haven't really defined in Canada what it means to have meaningful consultations. We've made some advances on that with the Chilcotin decision and this whole idea of consent versus consult, but I think we still have a long ways to go. And this is the one that really hits me as somebody interested in good decision making. I think there's a real lack of transparency. I'd like the information that's provided to participants to be with these proper sort of binnings, if we were able to sort it out. I'd like to see what happens to this information, and I'd like to see how things are balanced. I'd like to see how this balancing process works. And right now, that's completely a black box. We have a lot of vague and partial objectives. Objectives show what matters. Anyone of you who know stuff that I do, this is sort of the core. I really believe in value-focused thinking. I really believe in dialogue based on what matters, going back to work that Ralph Keeney and Howard Rafe and others have done. And I think once we say what matters, then we need to come up with attributes to define that. So again, every time someone like our energy minister in BC stands up and says, I love LNG, it creates jobs, what comes up for me is, well, what type of jobs? Where will those be? How many? For how long? Who are the candidates? Safety issues, family social implications. Jobs is just a word. It's a very broad, vague word. And it really doesn't tell us much. So I think we need to look much more closely at, well, what kinds of jobs? Seasonal versus full-time, et cetera. It's a lot there. So, and then, if we start thinking about good attributes to describe jobs or good performance measures, then that goes back to, well, is there an objective saying something like employment matters? Does it matter? If it does matter, is this particular way to achieve maybe some gains in employment, is that the best way? Maybe there's other ways. If we're going to spend billions of dollars and we care about employment, maybe there's other things we could do that might better satisfy that objective. So because we don't have clear objectives, clear attributes, each party basically can define concerns as they wish, and we end up with essentially biased testimonials. I don't think these panels get much of what I would call evidence. And again, because there isn't enough dialogue, I think they typically end up with biased testimonials and stories. And I would say a lot of the analyses that come out, a lot of what I look at are economic analyses or oil spill modeling analyses or tanker traffic analyses. Many of these that I've seen, I would say also are stories. They don't really fit, again, minimum standards for good work in these fields. As a result, I think it's often impossible to set priorities or identify weights. Which of all these concerns are most important? Those are the ones we want to focus on. right? We don't need to, we can't focus on 50 things at once, but if we could focus on 4 or 5 or 6 things, we'd be making much better decisions. So unless you have clear objectives, you don't know what you're waiting. You can't wait. I'm only on 4. I mean, it's already a fairly damning picture of energy choices, but we're only halfway there. And I'll keep an eye on time. I think very limited recognition of social, cultural, and health impacts. Again, this is the area that Terry and I have worked on. Most of the analyses focus on economic and biophysical effects, usually valued using market-based measures, dollar-based measures. As a result, essentially a second-tier status, contrary to legislation, is given to culture, societies, communities, and health, other than physical health, all the other things that bring good health to people. And that's not the way the law is set up. That's not the way the legislation is set up. But it is the way that the analyses are done. Very little attention given to the social, cultural, and non-physical health side. And I think we really need for each impact to ask what is significant for looking at culture, social changes in health, how large a gain or loss is significant. Under SIA, if something is less than significant, it's excluded from consideration in terms of adverse effects. Social and cultural effects that are not considered significant can essentially be dropped from detailed analyses. Just let that sink in for a minute. So, for example, in Kinder Morgan's or Trans Mountain's analyses, they identified 2 types of social cultural impacts that might be important in the context of the pipeline and shipping, et cetera. Both of those were actually dropped from detailed analysis because they were considered by somebody to not be significant. So you go from a shoddy job of defining the attributes to actually not having to deal with them at all. How are those determinations made? We have no criteria for that. None. I think that's very sad. So the bottom line is that a lot of the things I find in talking to people that actually go into the public interest, including society, culture, governance, concerns, and health, those aren't valued in dollars. If the changes as a result of a project are not considered significant, then they get dropped. Sometimes, there is one exception, where sometimes we do have multiple accounts. We'll have traditional use studies or things like that. I think traditional use studies can be valuable, but often they are not actually part of final decisions. They aren't integrated into decisions. We end up with a great traditional use study that sits on the shelf, and meanwhile, analyses continue. I think Northern Gateway is a good example of a lot of interesting data being collected, but because it wasn't integrated into the formal analyses, it didn't really influence the decision. So there's a lot of good examples using methods such as constructed scales. There's a lot of work that's been done. I've had a hand in it, but so have a lot of other people, using basically scales, indices for things like stewardship, community image, protection of spiritual sites, traditional food collection, public support, where you might have a scale like this where 1 is high public support, 5 is strong action-oriented opposition, fill in the intermediaries, and then you could do trade-offs with this. You could say, okay, we have a project, we expect that there's going to be maybe a 5, people won't like it, strong action-oriented opposition. What would we have to change in that project? What kind of mitigation would we do to move it to where it's much better accepted? So move it, say, to a level 5 to a level 3. If we don't have clear constructed scales or some way of counting these social and cultural impacts, we're not able to do that. So as a result, because you don't integrate these concerns into the decision-making process, I don't think we're really doing a good job of addressing the trade-offs. And yet, that is the bottom line for what these panels and large energy decisions are supposed to do. It's also what bottom line in a sense for what politicians are supposed to do. Help address those tough trade-offs to determine what actually is in the public interest. I think this hits particularly hard at First Nations or Métis communities. I won't talk more about that, except for this, again, sort of a catty note that I think oftentimes decision makers forget that the social sciences actually exist. Science is equated with the biophysical side or the natural side rather than the social side. Other things, and these are not in any order. In other words, number 6 is not less important than number 2. We don't have any standards for dealing with or communicating uncertainty. There's tremendous amounts of uncertainty as we look at these large investments going into the future around pricing and markets, also around environmental concerns, also around social cultural concerns. So this aspect of prediction, of looking into the future, of looking 30, 40, 50 years into the future, unavoidably brings uncertainty into the picture. And yet, revenues, profits, impacts, all these are subject to uncertainty. We haven't really made decisions at a national level or provincial level. How should we estimate that? How should it be reported? How will it be communicated? What's a good enough job of representing uncertainty? And what often is done is to work with mean or median values, but these estimates vary widely by orders of magnitude. And we don't ask the questions, well, what if the low values occur? What if the high values occur? The shock right now across Canada about oil prices having dropped below $80 a barrel or hovering around there and what it means. Anybody in their right minds in predicting anything around oil sands activity 2 years ago, 5 years ago, would have seen that there's some sort of range of possible prices for a barrel of oil. Prices have varied a lot over the last 40 years. There's no reason to think that prices aren't going to continue to vary. And so there's a lot of good work has been done on how do you think about this? Do you want an 80% confidence interval? So roughly 10% of the values at each tail, high and low, will be outside of that 80% confidence interval. 90%, 95%. How do you report it? How do you communicate it? How do you make that information be understood by the various decision makers, including the stakeholders who participate? Tough questions and very interesting questions. And again, as I keep saying, good methods exist for incorporating communicating uncertainty. Lots of great work on, for example, climate change. The IPCC has put out some great stuff. I've seen Hadi's name on some of this and I've seen Melin's name on stuff. So, I mean, we have that knowledge base. We know a lot more about communicating uncertainty than we do. If we use it in climate change, why not use it on these large energy projects? Yeah. It's not quite as simple as opening up one of the IPCC manuals and bringing it in, but that at least would give us a start. Probabilities and verbal evaluative labels for uncertainty. It's out there. Let's use it, and we don't. No explicit comparison of alternatives. Not really even thinking, well, what are the alternatives? Often, with both, for example, Trans Mountain Kinder Morgan and with Enbridge Northern Gateway, some of the most reasonable alternatives to that particular configuration of a particular pipeline were ruled out of scope by the panels. So it's really nice work. A psychologist called Chris Z, who's talked a lot about evaluability. I don't think we can say, is this any good? Like, is this a good clicker? I don't know. I mean, it seems to work. But in order to really say whether this is a good clicker, if I was going to spend billions of dollars on clickers, I'd want to know what else is out there. Are there better ones, worse ones, cheaper ones, more efficient, longer lasting? Maybe there's a whole other technology, voice activated or something. You know, there's maybe other things. We don't know that for energy systems. So we're making decisions around pipelines without having brought in, I think, sufficient information about natural gas, wind, geothermal, other kinds of alternatives, demand side constraints, et cetera. That stuff is generally ruled out of scope. We need to decide on, you know, do I want to spend billions of dollars on clickers like this? Without making our decisions more evaluable, without being able to make better sense of options through this comparison generation, then it's very hard to know. So, and it also reduces, this bottom part, reduces creativity and learning. We really have a hard time, I think. Each of these projects is kind of a one-off. If we had objectives, if we had ways of producing uncertainty, if we had criteria around generating alternatives, we actually could learn and maybe over time do better on decisions. Right? Those of you who, you know, make decisions like whatever, who do you want to date or who should be your spouse? You know, we all get a fair amount of training in that. You know, we meet somebody when we're 14, and somebody when we're 17, and somebody when we're 22. We actually we should get relatively decent at those decisions by the time we have to make consequential ones. Why don't we do that on large energy projects? We don't. And this is just one of many tools, consequence tables, for comparing alternatives. Basically, think about your objectives, maybe some economic, some social, some cultural, some environmental. Come up with measures for them, define those well, and then basically grade your alternatives in terms of the things that matter. And notice I have 4 things here, not 800. So consequence tables, well-known tool, widely used. Again, not very widely used in energy decisions in Canada. Because of all this, we can't really make clear trade-offs, even though, as I said a couple times, that's the bottom line, the public interest. If you're making trade-offs, you have to balance across objectives. If we don't know our objectives, then you can't do that balancing. And I think explicit trade-offs lead to transparent decisions. Again, the gentleman here with the hat, not implicit trade-offs, but explicit trade-offs. And an interesting thing here is that trade-offs almost always involve winners or losers. You know, dams do kill fish. Tankers do leak oil. Parks do reduce development options. Almost nothing comes as a wholly good or wholly bad thing. So I'd love it to have these winners and losers, pros and cons, gains and losses, much more explicit. We don't usually do that. And I think trade-offs are why we need a defensible evaluation process, as well as wise political leaders. If there weren't trade-offs, we don't need all this stuff. But there are trade-offs, always. And that's why we need a better decision-making process. Last couple. Very little recognition of the psychological aspects of decision-making. Things like prominence effect, which is going for the one dimension or 2 dimensions that kind of quickly grab you. Anchoring on recent events that are more salient. Sunk costs. We've invested all this money in something. Maybe it now looks like it isn't a good idea, but we have invested all this money, so that we don't look like fools, we're going to continue it. So, great story of USAID and the Agency for International Development in the 60s or 70s, I think, that built half a bridge. This is in Chile, I believe, and then there was an earthquake, so the town on the other side vanished. Just simply wasn't there anymore. Everybody had to move, but they still went ahead and completed, literally, the bridge to nowhere because they'd gotten halfway through. And we do that all the time with energy projects, all the time. If we're learning things that say that even though we've invested money and time and resources in something, if at this point on we know that it's not a good idea, let's drop it. Let's not be prey to sunk costs. So great. I'm sure a lot of you are pretty familiar with some of the heuristics and psychology decision-making literature. But an important point, decision makers and technical experts usually are not trained in making choices. So this whole thing about judgmental biases, basically our decision makers and technical experts tend to be just as prone to decision errors as anyone else. In other words, you can be a high-powered decision maker with no training in decision making. UBC has some courses in decision making. Most colleges have courses in decision making. There's a lot of executive MBA programs that give training in decision making. I'd love it if any politician, anybody who wins office, has to take a decision making course. It's not going to happen, but I think it would be great. So 10th on my list of 10, very limited recognition of linked impacts and cumulative effects. So for example, links between pipelines and oil sand production are either not looked at or looked at only cursorily or excluded from consideration. Trans Mountain, the Kinder Morgan, very important link between pipelines and added rail traffic. Kinder Morgan does not go through. What does that mean about rail traffic shipments of products from the oil sands? Kinder Morgan does go through. What does that mean, et cetera. And I think one of the important cumulative effects is just capacity demands on municipal governments and on First Nations especially to evaluate this information. I do a fair amount of pro bono work for people up in the north of BC, and I know some very good risk analysts who routinely will have 3 or 4 major projects come through their desk a week. These are things that anybody would, usually require a couple months to do. They get, they're lucky if they have a day. So they outsource some of this to people like myself who are willing to take it on, but huge capacity demands. And part of what that means, because we don't have this thinking about linked impacts, there's a lot of just not much incentive to try to learn across evaluations. So importantly, I think these criticisms are being addressed. Things are being better done as part of energy strategy and project planning in other countries. UK has, I think, some very good deliberative processes, nuclear energy, climate change, as well as energy systems. A guy named Nick Pigeon is quite involved in some of this, psychologist, very, very good. BC has a very good deliberative process, I think, that started in the 90s, the water use planning process for hydroelectric facilities. And there's a lot of other examples. So my point is Canada does not need to reinvent the wheel. It simply, I think, needs to meet minimum standards and adopt widely used methods. And we, thus far, have not shown much uptake or much willingness to do that. So overall suggestions for improvements, I think we need guidelines to encourage deliberation. We need to recognize there are multiple dimensions of value, which throws us into the trade-off world. We need to separate facts and values. We need to do a much better job on incorporating uncertainty. We need to establish a process, explicit process that encourages transparency. Rather than having some review boards that take years and years and years, I'd love to make process changes quickly. We could get good people from Canada, good people from the US, good people from the UK, rewrite some of these standards and rules. And I think within 6 months we could change the way things are done in Canada and BC in a much better way. And then we could learn from experience. Wouldn't be perfect, but something new would be in place, something better would be in place, and let's learn from that. There's a phrase, the perfect is the enemy of the good, something like that. I think we can come up with the good quite easily. And I think I would also love to see National Energy Board, SIA staff, Prime Minister's staff, and provincial government staff all trained in decision making. That's not going to happen, but I'd love that. So just a couple, I think, excellent books. Those of you who aren't familiar with decision making literature, Smart Choices, very readable, bestseller. Hammond, Keeney, and Rafa, very, very good introduction to what I think is a very sensible decision-making process. 2 other good books, The Feeling of Risk, Perspectives on Risk Perception, edited by Paul Slovic. A lot of good stuff in there, and then Thinking Fast and Slow, Dan Kahneman's book, which some of you know. And bottom message, I think we can do much better when it comes to decision-making processes for planning, selecting, and developing large energy projects in Canada. And it matters. It matters to me. I think it matters to Canada as a society. So, thank you. Questions, comments? Anything anybody would? Agreements, disagreements, insights? Yes? Yep. Yep. I don't disagree with anything that she said. I think I'm stuck with where my expertise is. I'm not an expert in political systems. I have no plans to run for office. But I am a very strong believer in the benefits of good decision making. And I have this naive trust, which I've seen enacted quite a number of times, of people being really against something. And then once they see that there's another way to look at it, that then they change their minds. They start thinking differently. So I just sort of, so that I can get up out of bed every day and keep doing what I'm doing, I think I am a strong believer that many of these people who you would characterize as political people sort of lined up against some of this, I think many of them are ignorant in the sense of ignorant in knowing that there's a different way to look at these things than they do. And I do have, a fair amount of firsthand experience with, cabinet ministers and high-up folks like that. And I think very often they simply didn't realize, for example, that there are ways to measure cultural and social effects. They haven't realized that there are ways to make trade-offs across incommensurables. Very important legal scholar in the U.S., Cass Sunstein, has written a lot about this. And Cass deals with many of these same people. He's now director of Office of Management and Budget or something like that in the U.S., very high position. But he has that same experience, that many times people think they're doing the best thing, but actually they just don't know how to put these parts together. And so all I can offer is there is a way to put these parts together. Things that you think you can't make trade-offs over, you can. Things that you think you can't measure, you can. And that's all I can contribute. So it doesn't negate anything you're saying, but it's just not what I can do. Some people cut hair, some people do decision making, some people fix pipes, and I can only sort of do what I do. No, it's no. There's a lot of things like the political system lying behind this. There's gender stuff. There's all kinds of things. Environmental justice. So I'm just taking this very narrow little part that I might be able to contribute something. I agree with you. Yes, sir. So, first of all, I'm a big fan of I think I had adaptive or flexible there in some of those slides. And I'm working on, not in energy systems, but in water quality and things. I am working on several adaptive management plans. That's where I think we need this lack of energy strategies. That's where that comes in. Because I think an energy strategy would say there's certain decisions that need to be made before we're making a decision, green light, red light for the pipeline, green light, red light for increased rail traffic. All those things, I think, come after a dialogue that we haven't had around energy strategies. And if we had that dialogue about energy strategies, then I think there'd be a sequencing of decisions that we need to make. And without that context, without that strategy sort of enveloping all this, I think the residual, we're stuck with these one-off decisions, which is really unfortunate. So I think because we don't have energy strategy in place, we're kind of not able to be adaptive. These are handled as one-off decisions, and they shouldn't. Does that make sense? And again, thinking about something like modern hospital. I don't know why I'm stuck on hospitals today, but modern hospital. They do have systems. Somebody comes in with a cardiac problem. There's a whole system that combines all sorts of people to make these decisions. Again, we don't have that, and that would require input not just from government and companies, but at the formation stage, it require input from people who know about the social side, who know about energy systems, who know about cultural impacts. And they aren't being involved. Yes? exactly. Well, I think it would be broad. Oh, question was, I said we don't do much with looking at alternatives. And comment was correctly made that SIA does now require, I think since 2012, that proponents come up with an alternatives analysis. Pardon me? What is SIA? You've got the expert behind you. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, CEAA. Yeah, so the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, which also has a staff. So, for example, at Northern Gateway, there were SIA representatives there. So it's an act plus a staff plus quite a bit of nice-sounding legislation. So we've got these requirements because the proponent does it. Two things. One is I think it tends to be very narrow in scope. And three things. Second, because the proponent does it, it's not going to be trusted by a lot of parties. Most importantly, because the proponent does it without standards, then the alternatives analyses don't have to handle some of these questions I've been raising. How do you present uncertainty? What about the qualities of your modeling, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's done in-house and very little questioning. Now, in something like Northern Gateway, Enbridge was essentially forced to redo some of their alternatives analyses, and it got better, but it was still a long ways away from being what I would call good. So, but the fact that SIA did that, the fact that SIA put that into the 2010, or 2012, is it regulations? Is that the right word? Okay. There's more. Yeah, I think there's more words around it, but the fact it's sort of a move in the right direction. So I'm happy to see that, but I don't think it should be proponent. I think it should be done by the government and done in a much more open, transparent way.
Bit of an unfinished thought, but a few years ago I was at a 3-day dialogue or conference that was on the common topic, common good.
Mm-hmm.
And unbeknownst to each other, three secret politicians redefined the common good as the public interest. And I know because each of them wasn't there for the speech before them over the recent days. And the concern for me around this reframing of the common good and the public interest is that it kind of became a justification in each of their speeches for kind of a utilitarian sort of logic, even whether they were thinking about individual values or
Mm-hmm.
political values. And in the same sort of way, kind of thinking about this problem in terms of the public interest
Mm-hmm.
almost becomes an easy justification for pipelines and for new projects.
I agree.
So I'm just trying to think, how do we reframe
It's a great,
away from public
right.
interest, redefine the public interest as the common good?
It's a great dialogue. Great question. Yeah. So if the common good becomes the public interest, does this set us back? Sort of what is it? So I would say the public interest or the common good are both vague, undefined terms. So the same kinds of things where I was hitting on the word jobs, same way I would hit on a term like whether it's common good or public interest, or a term like sustainable. I think a great analogy is look what's going on in the U.S. With the information that Snowden released and the NSA and so on, where all sorts of things now are done in the, quote, public interest or national security. I mean, national security is another one of these words, very similar, which, depending on who's in charge of how it's defined, can mean great things or can mean very draconian, I think really tragic, terrible things. So these words, I think, need definition. They need definition, they need scope. We've done a little bit of this in Canada again, but not at an operational level. So it's more at almost a philosophical level, I would say, in terms of defining the public interest. If it were in terms of objectives, attributes, if we actually had tried things out, I would feel much more comfortable. We haven't done this. So I think the important thing is what is its named, but not what is it named, but how is it operationalized? Which is my problem with national security issues in the U.S. I don't like how it's being operationalized. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So just thinking, about what kinds of
Mhm. Mhm.
Another possibility might be what Michael Byers was talking about. Under the data pipeline.
Yep.
It's basically to erect an independent, basically entity process
Mhm.
for the pipeline.
Mhm.
One that would be perhaps built around your 10 principles.
Mhm.
So done right, perhaps if done right,
Mhm.
done independently by some foundation, show the representation what it could actually look like.
Mhm.
And obviously, it couldn't do everything right. It would be a lot of policy strategy,
Mhm.
the foundation. But I just wonder, what are your thoughts? I mean, it's always hard to sell a process and tell it go. It's a process is really hard to actually run. Do you like either of those options? Do you have possibilities? You see on the other hand?
I'm not. I mean, I think I would be worried about a referendum process in terms of holding elections on these. I like the idea of an independent process, but again, I mean that is what the NEB process is supposed to be. I also don't think it's independent. So I think we would need to really work hard to think about a way of actually creating that. I think we have the tools in terms of legislation like SIA. I think it actually does give us the tools to do that. I think that another important group that we need to bring into this picture in Canada is the courts, because very often now, because of these, I think, very lackluster decision-making processes, we end up sort of de facto punting a lot of this over to judges, who end up making these very critical decisions that I think really should be matters of public policy rather than court decisions. So I think so the whole system, I think, really needs to be rejigged. I'm thinking also about guys like Gary Ellison, having just left, the former CEO of BC Hydro, having left the Northern Gateway, having left the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain deliberations because he feels that they're a sham. Made a big public statement, headlines in the news, and then within 48 hours just kind of dropped away. And I don't think any changes have happened to that process. So if somebody like he couldn't get anywhere, then I'm not sure where we go with this. And again, I come back to I think each of us in the room, we have our small areas of expertise, energy systems, more knowledge of SIA than I have, et cetera. And I think if we hack away, maybe we can move things around. So part of why I do what I do is so I don't go crazy being ineffective at the large scale, but possibly can be just a little bit effective at a smaller scale. Yeah. Yep. I think that's absolutely terrific. No, I think I have tried with, I'd say, limited success. I think somebody with sort of more savvy, maybe more charm than I have, looking at someone like you, could perhaps pull that off. I think the time is ripe for doing that, particularly now in BC. I think we've got a couple years before you have another provincial election. I think it's a great thing to do. I don't think, for example, the NDP in British Columbia has shown a lot of savvy in how to make those kinds of arguments. So, but I think I think it's a possibility, and I think it's a great idea. So anyone who has the courage to do that, I definitely encourage you to do it. As well as we've got members of parliament, we've got people in Ottawa to go see and knock on their doors. I mean, there's a lot of ways to make changes. We've got people in the GVRD, just go downtown and knock on doors. So I think there are political leaders who are in a position to make many of these changes, and I definitely think that that's a good avenue. Just one sentence, I know we're getting close to time. The other thing that I think is also great is I'd love to get more of this dialogue and more of the decision-making capabilities into schools. So I think another way to go to the people at the top, politicians, decision makers. I think it would be great also to go to third graders and sixth graders and help them to think about objectives, help them to think about trade-offs, and help them to sort of think through decisions at this level. So maybe 20 or 30 years from now, when they grow up and take on positions of power, maybe it'll change. So everybody here who, with children, I think you have just that same kind of responsibility to work with the future decision makers and make sure that your 7-year-old knows how to make good decisions. Is that enough of an answer for now?
Yeah, I think that we should have a workshop.
I think if we could have politicians here and 7-year-olds there and hear some of that dialogue, I think it would be great. I'd love it. My pleasure. Okay, good. It seemed some interest, so that's good. Great. I'm
I
Robin.
already introduced myself, Naveen Raman.
You're Naveen. Okay,
Yes.
so we were sharing an office,
yes,
but never saw
exactly.
each other.